Welcome to Tiger Chainsaw Interviews. These exclusive interviews will give you a behind-the-scenes retrospective mixed in with some amazing secrets of your favorite games and franchises by the developers and creators of them. Now, if I have filmed the interview, you'll be able to watch it. Otherwise, it's a phone interview, so just sit back and relax. Now, I have done some incredible exclusive interviews with some amazing gaming legends in this community. So hit that sub button to make sure you don't miss any of those interviews. Alright, let's get to our interview of the day. Today, I am joined by Chris Corry, who would work on some of the biggest franchises in video games, including multiple Star Wars games, multiple Lord of the Ring games, the Command & Conquer series, and even some new games like Beat Saber and Marvel Iron Man VR. But this interview will be mostly focused on the first game that Chris ever worked on, Star Wars Starfighter. He was the lead programmer for Star Wars Starfighter, and I'm looking forward to a behind-the-scenes interview on the game. Chris, thank you so much for joining me today. Now, I was looking at your game credits, and to my knowledge, it seems as if Star Wars Starfighter was actually the first game that you ever worked on. What was your journey into the video game industry? What were you doing before then, and how did you land the role of the programmer for Star Wars Starfighter?
You know, I came to the games industry through kind of a circuitous route. I had always been a gamer and, really caught the bug for programming computers very early in the late 70s and early 80s, which, God, as I say that, just seems so long ago. And of course, in those early days, when you're sort of puttering around on your little Commodore 64 or whatever people have in their houses at that point, really what you did was you would make games, and maybe you'd buy an enthusiast magazine and sort of type in the game listings in the basic programming language. But gaming was sort of an integral part of sort of the home computing experience in the late 70s and early 80s, and certainly as you saw the emergence of the Apple II and eventually sort of the growth of the PC. So I was always big into games then, and that sort of followed through. I caught that programming bug. I knew I wanted to become an engineer. I knew I wanted to code, and went through college that way, and always felt like, okay, I'll probably just go into sort of a traditional, read that as boring kind of technology career. And when I graduated from college, I moved down to Washington, D.C., and worked for a technology consulting firm, and really sort of poured myself into that. At that time, an emerging technology was object-oriented programming. C++ was in its early days. It was nascent. There was lots of activity there. And that was kind of my specialty. But throughout that entire time, I was always on my free time. I always wanted to play games. That was always sort of a background hobby for me. So the other kind of flip side of that was Star Wars. I mean, as a child in the 70s, Star Wars was really just a seismic experience for me. I mean, it just kind of reformatted my brain and just had this extraordinary influence on me. So in the 90s, when George announced that he was making the prequels, I was like, oh my God, I've got to find some way to be a part of this. So, there were some alumni connections through my wife's university at ILM, and I tried to get in there, and nothing really came of it. And I was knocking on doors and sending resumes. Nothing. Absolutely nothing happened there. And eventually I was just like, okay, it's just not going to happen. I'm not going to be able to have anything to do with that. And probably just a short time after, who knows if it was months or a couple of years, I got a call from my friend Brett Duville. He was a college friend of mine. We had known each other for years and had kept in touch. And Brett had taken a job out at LucasArts, and he called me up and he said, Chris, we're looking for a lead engineer on a Star Wars game, and your name came up, and I'd like to make an introduction to our executive producer, our project lead, Darren Stinnett, and I think this would be something, that would really be great for you. And, one thing led to another, and, it took a while to sort of close the deal, but eventually signed up and headed out west. We were in Washington, D.C. I was newly married, and me and my new bride headed out and relocated to Marin County, California, to pursue my dream of not just working for the Star Wars company, but also doing computer games.
How cool is that? From being captivated by Star Wars as a child to actually being able to work on one of the games for the franchise. That's an amazing journey that you had. Now, let's talk about the game itself, Star Wars Starfighter. How was the project described to you when you first started, and what was the creative vision for this game?
So I think it's important to acknowledge that at the very beginning, Starfighter was not Starfighter. Starfighter was a different thing. So at LucasArts, we knew that we were going to have the prequel films coming out. So obviously we wanted to have games that were tightly connected to that. And of course, if you look at the legacy, that sort of backwards arc of LucasArts and all the amazing games that they have made, on the Star Wars side, one of the ones that had really become legendary were the X-Wing games, and X-Wing and TIE Fighter games by Larry Holland. So, the top line was, all right, let's do the prequel version of X-Wing. And on top of that, we felt like we had some secret sauce, or like this sort of amazing idea that I believe probably originated with Darren Stinnett, who was the project lead. And that was this idea that, yes, okay, you could sort of dogfight around these terrestrial environments, on the ground, but then you could just sort of pull back on the stick and you could just rocket up and seamlessly transition from planet side out into to outer space. And then you could do, space dogfights as well. And that was, I think, a pretty inspiring vision for a lot of us. We had no idea how to make it happen. At the time, the title was intended to be a PC title, and but we sort of dove in and figured, all right, let's get our feet dirty and figure out how to make this extraordinarily difficult thing happen. Because, of course, with the computer hardware of that day, the technical demands of doing something like that were non-trivial, and it was going to be a very difficult engineering problem. So obviously, that sort of core tenet, and certainly the destination platform, did not survive. Neither of those things ended up being a part of Starfighter. In time, I think we came to realize that the technical demands of that sort of vision, that transition from planet to space, were going to be very difficult to pull off, particularly in the time that we had. And sort of in that general time frame, Sony announced the PlayStation 2. And there was, the leadership at LucasArts was like, well, we obviously want to support the new platform. And they approached Darren and the team and said, look, we want your space sim, your space flight sim game to become a PlayStation 2 launch title. And it's worth noting that at the time, there were kind of two factions within LucasArts, and factions probably isn't the right word, but there were generally those people who had worked on console games and those people who had worked on PC games. And the console game guys were, they were super hardcore. They were used to working on what were essentially embedded systems. They were used to working on these machines that had very constrained memory footprints and obviously, pretty nominal hardware capabilities compared to cutting-edge PCs, and had this sort of hardcore discipline to how they organized their code that was pretty old school, but was very performance friendly. Whereas people who worked on PC, they knew that they had virtual memory and, were able to sort of build out systems that were vast and complicated and sprawling, but would be difficult to sort of shoehorn into the console mindset. And we, in my team, we were really more on sort of the PC side. I mean, I'd never coded a professional video game in my life, but I certainly came from, that PC background. I'd never worked on a console. And here the company was saying, well, Chris, we want you to lead this engineering team on a console. And I was like, oh, Jesus, this is going to be tough. I mean, so it was, part of it is I was just young, right? I mean, I was in my probably mid to late 20s. I didn't know any better. I'm like, sure, let's do it. Let's dive in. And that began sort of this extraordinary journey.
So as much as I love video games, I don't know the first thing about programming them or coding them, so I have a lot of respect for you. Chris, what were your daily duties as the lead programmer for Starfighter? What were you doing every day, and what was the most challenging part of your job?
Well, first of all, I've got to acknowledge this is going back, some 25 years. So, the memories are all very hazy. So, any apologies to someone who hears this and sort of rolls their eyes and it's like, no, that's not at all the way it was. But in the early days, a lot of it was just scaffolding and infrastructure, which is something that I was very comfortable doing, was building out a lot of the support systems, a lot of the I/O systems and sort of internal scripting capabilities, a lot of just sort of the basic scaffolding for the game engine that you need before you can even sort of fire up the renderer, before you can even start talking about the mechanics of the game and the actual gameplay. So it was really actually fortuitous that I was able to start with that, because first of all, that was all stuff that I felt very comfortable with. And, I didn't have expertise in 3D math, which is a necessity for being a graphics programmer and really for being, for a lot of gameplay mechanics stuff as well. But I knew I could do systems programming. I knew I could build out this stuff, and in a way that I felt would be durable and flexible and extensible, which was always kind of a core sort of guiding technical ethic for me as I designed software. So the early days were really just that. And, my friend Brett was there, and we had maybe a couple other guys. But at that point, we were starting to build out the rest of the team. And so my job did evolve. I mean, I was always writing a lot of code. Again, it was a lot of the more sort of system side code, but then, we would have, someone like a Steve Ash would come in and he would be sort of the graphics programmer and help out with that, or Dave Kothuk would come on and help with graphics engineering. And then at one point we hired a gentleman named Andrew Kermsey, and that was a tremendous accelerant to the engineering team, because Andrew, he and his brother Chris had created one of the very first MMORPGs. Andrew was just a completely, brilliant guy, but also had this very sort of quiet and humble demeanor. He wasn't trying to sort of prove anything to anyone, but he was absolutely brilliant, and you didn't have to spend a lot of time with him to sort of realize that. And so, pretty early on, Brett and Andrew and I really created a very tight sort of working relationship. The three of us shared an office. And it was just a lot of, in modern day engineering parlance, it was a lot of sort of Scrum-based activity. It was all very agile, which is really kind of a way of admitting that we were just kind of making it up as we went along. We didn't have a lot of sort of tight production processes and things that later on in my career I would really come to value. but the three of us working, tightly iterating on systems and passing work back and forth between the three of us, it was an extraordinary time, and I still have just, absolutely tremendously fond memories of that.
Chris, I know that you just mentioned that you shared an office. Can you transport us back to your desk during this project? What was it like, and what was the atmosphere at LucasArts at the time? Can you describe that era to us?
Well, it's funny because I just finished watching the 6-part documentary on Disney Plus about ILM, which I certainly recommend to anyone who has the time to see it. And it's funny, how in sort of the middle lifespan of ILM, how much of that reminded me of LucasArts. So ILM and LucasArts were different companies in different buildings. They were down in Kerner. We were on the Los Gatos office. But the vibe was very much the same. You'd come walking into the building, and there'd be sort of standees from previous LucasArts games. It had this sort of industrial creative aesthetic to it, and then as you would start walking through the office space, it was kind of hybrid. Some parts were open plan, along with offices on sort of the interior offices, so half cubes, half offices. All of it was kind of, though, gently organized chaos. So beanbag chairs strewn all about, and posters on the wall, and people sort of coming in at all times of the day and night, working crazy hours, and then just sort of Star Wars and geek memorabilia everywhere. And in many respects, what I just described is a pretty good description of any game studio these days. I mean, I spend a lot of time in game studios to this day, and kind of that sort of game developer aesthetic hasn't evolved a whole lot. I mean, it's still as casual as people can make it, and it's still just seeped in popular culture, seeped in genre fiction and IP, and just everyone has their figurines from their favorite anime and movies and TV shows, and it was much the same thing 25 years ago.
Sounds like an awesome place to work at. Now, you already answered my question that I was going to ask about if you were a Star Wars fan growing up. So I definitely know that you were, but for you, what was it like to work on arguably the biggest franchise of all time? You said so yourself, you loved it growing up. And did you ever meet George Lucas during your time there?
So I did nominally meet George. So the Lucas companies at that time had a number of big shared events, and the three biggest shared events were probably the 4th of July picnic up at the ranch, and then the Halloween party, and then the Christmas party. And it was very common at the Halloween or at really all three events that people would sort of approach George and ask if they could get their picture taken with him and talk to him, or say a few words. And I think has been widely reported, George is not an outgoing, gregarious, social person. So I think he was always pretty uncomfortable in those sort of large social settings. But I think he was always pretty game. So there were certainly a couple times when I'm sure at one of those events, I don't remember anything in particular, but I know that there were times when I would approach George and say a few things, here or there. He certainly didn't really know me from a hole in the ground. But then there was one moment, as Starfighter was probably about halfway in its development, which is to say really very early days, but we had some visuals up on the screen that actually were starting to look kind of decent. And we had a company meeting that was, at that point, LucasArts was large enough that we didn't have open space in sort of the core LucasArts company areas where everyone could get together. So we would actually go downstairs in a larger room close to what we would call the channel down in the basement, and we had a big sort of company meeting there that George attended, and that was kind of a big deal because George typically would not attend LucasArts company meetings, and we showed demos and a lot of footage from there, and that was kind of a big coming out, or it was a big moment, I think, for a lot of the team, because it was an opportunity to share with our peers in the company what we were doing on the Starfighter project, and certainly, having George see that was a big thing for us. And I remember pretty clearly, as the meeting was broken up, racing over to George and just desperate for some sort of some sort of connection, right? I mean, some sort of feedback that, look, that this is good. What you've been working on for the past, year and a half or two is good. And I was like, George, my name is Chris Corry. I'm lead engineer on the Starfighter team, and just was wondering what you thought. And I clearly, like, George clearly felt put on the spot. I'm not so, I don't think he was terribly blown away by it, but I think he was probably, he's like, oh, that's good. I thought it was good. It was impressive. Keep on going. And then he just turns away and walks off. And I'm like, oh, man, but I thought we were going to spend 30 minutes and sit down and talk all about Star Wars and religion and politics and how much you love my game. And yeah, that was not George's jam. Like, he was not down to like that. And but it was still a moment, and it's still, something that I remember to this day.
Yeah, that is a really special memory. That's a fun one too. I loved hearing that one. What was the reception around LucasArts when the game was released? Were you personally nervous on launch day? How did the team feel once the game hit the market?
Well, it was a big deal for LucasArts, really for no other reason than it was our first PlayStation 2 game. And I think we felt very proud of our efforts. I think we felt like we had really poured our heart and soul into it. From an engineering standpoint, I felt really good about kind of where the tech had lined up. But, just speaking for myself, I also knew that the game sort of felt like a console game that had been built by, PC programmers and wasn't sort of as optimally, it wasn't as optimized and performant as perhaps, a really experienced console development team could deliver. And sort of in parallel, towards the latter part of our development cycle, Factor 5 had been working on the Rogue Squadron games for the Nintendo 64, and we had been seeing what that looked like, and those guys killed it. I mean, those guys were experienced Nintendo programmers, knew that hardware, and had actually been consulted by Nintendo on the development of the hardware, and really did something very special with Rogue Squadron. So in the back of our minds, we saw, personally, I was, it was hard not to say, okay, well, Rogue Squadron's an amazing looking game, has amazing gameplay. Starfighter doesn't meet quite that bar. But that didn't detract from, the development experience, and it didn't detract from our pride of rolling this game out. Because, the headwinds were actually strong. I mean, the PlayStation 2 was actually a very exotic piece of hardware. It was a very different sort of experience than just sort of sitting down and writing code on for the PC. We had a lot of help, particularly on the graphics side, and getting sort of our graphics engine up and going. And when you sort of considered everything that went into it and how sophisticated that product ended up being and the tools that we built around that, I just remember a tremendous sense of pride, not just for the final product, but for my team members and all the extraordinary people that I got to share that experience with. And in the lead up to that, we had a number of marketing events where, I think we did game signings, I think, at the Metreon with T-shirts and, a bunch of things. So it was a really exciting time, particularly for someone like myself who had not been in the games industry. This was my first games launch. I think we were all... You have to understand, game developers, you never know what you've got. I mean, even if you've worked on something for a long time, and maybe in some cases, particularly if you've worked on something for a long time, you get very close to it. And after a while, your ability to sort of critically discern whether or not what you're building is fundamentally good or not gets very diluted because you're just so close to it. And it's not uncommon for game developers to, come up on launch day and go, well, I think it's pretty good, but not really know, have that sort of strong undercurrent of doubt, and then be tremendously surprised when their game does extraordinarily well or extraordinarily poorly. And in the case of Starfighter, I think we felt pretty confident, but there's just always that anxiety that comes with game launch, and Starfighter was no different. So it came out, the reviews started to come out, and thankfully they were quite positive. So I think there was definitely a big sigh of relief that we hadn't messed it up, that we had done something that we could be proud of, and that we felt like was legitimate and was sort of a real contribution to the Star Wars gaming canon.
Oh, absolutely. I find the game very enjoyable, and almost all of the reviews are positive, so I think you guys can definitely pat yourselves on the back with Starfighter. Now, is there anything that you can think of that would be considered an Easter egg or something that's not well known about Starfighter? Anything that you can share with us? Any facts that would make the audience go, wow, that is really cool, or I didn't know that? And if not, no big deal.
I think the only thing that really comes to mind is, at the time, a lot of us on the team were big fans of the Penny Arcade webcomic.
Yep.
So, one of the codes, there was a code entry screen there, and I think Brett put in a code for Penny Arcade. It was literally the words Penny Arcade or something, or some sort of abbreviation of that, that would unlock God mode. And I don't think we broadly publicized that until maybe sometime later. But that's the only real sort of Easter egg that I know of. I know there were other things that were sort of snuck into the game and made it through, but nothing else really comes to mind.
Okay, Chris, this is my favorite question to ask, and I ask it to everyone. I get such unique answers, and you may have already answered it with the George Lucas memory, but what is that one defining memory that you will always remember when looking back during your time working on Starfighter? It could be something funny, something serious, or just a vivid feeling that you will always associate with the game. Do you have something like that?
I have so many fond memories of that time. And, certainly meeting George Lucas is, that was a big deal. But, when I look back at that time of my career, I don't think back about, George Lucas. I think back to the time I spent with people on the team who, again, this was my first foray into the games industry and into game development. So it was such a formative experience for me. And it was just a constant, learning experience, that sort of rush, that sort of hunger to get into the office because I knew I was going to learn something new, was really, that's the kind of thing that got me going in the morning. And probably for the next 25 years, I never felt anything sort of exactly like that again. In time, I would sort of graduate out of my engineering roles and move into production roles, and then later in my career, executive roles. So it wasn't really, that it was just kind of that one moment, that first sort of exposure to the entire development process that I'm left with the most fond memories of. I will say, people often ask, oh, well, did you ever go up to Skywalker Ranch and, things like that. Working at the Lucas companies during that period was absolutely wonderful and lovely. And, it was relatively easy for us to go up to the ranch and, book conference rooms at the ranch or Big Rock and spend time up there if we wanted to, or if we wanted to kind of manufacture an excuse to. So I do have very fond memories of Skywalker Ranch as well. But really, more than anything, it is, it's the people and that sort of first entry into the games industry. And it's something that sort of put the bug in me, and that's what I've been doing for the rest of my life.
Admittedly, I am extremely jealous of the things you got to experience with the Skywalker Ranch and LucasArts, and it just sounds like an amazing era that you were able to work through. Chris, I cannot thank you enough for your time today. You shed some light on Starfighter and how it came to be, as well as insight on LucasArts and some behind-the-scenes facts. I had a wonderful time talking with you. Now, I do have one last question left, and that's, what are you up to these days? Are you still in the gaming industry, or are you doing anything else? Is there anything that you'd like to plug or promote?
Well, nothing really to plug. After LucasArts, I went to Electronic Arts and sort of worked my way up through the studio system there, and then went from there and was the general manager for and co-founder of Zynga's first game studio, and then moved there with a bunch of friends, founded a mobile game company, sold that, So, a long sequence of sort of just new experiences covering PC console and then social web canvas and then mobile. And these days I now work at Meta in the VR division within Oculus, and I help run operations for our stable of first-party development studios that we've acquired over the past few years there. So now I'm doing VR. So the common thread there, I think, is just sort of an acute interest and hunger in sort of pursuing the new, and I think a lot of game developers feel that way. And for anyone whoever seriously considers game development as a career, it is a tough road. It is hard. It can sometimes be difficult to break into, and then once you're in, the challenges can sometimes feel a little bit overwhelming. But I will say, it has served me very well over the last 25 years or so, and I have very few regrets.
So that was my interview with Chris Corry, the lead programmer of Star Wars Starfighter. What did you learn today about that game, or what was your favorite question or answer? Let me know in the comments below, and be sure to subscribe to my channel to watch plenty of exclusive interviews with writers, programmers, producers, and many others who have worked in the gaming industry. Thanks for listening.